Now we're at a critical topic, the sources of the Qur'an. Strange story, this book. It's an interesting historical journey with the Qur'an. It doesn't stand still, doesn't certainly provide a reliable source that one would say that this is a book for me and what it says, with all the nonsense going on, grammatical errors and so on. Now, the sources of the Qur'an. In the earlier sections of this paper, quite a good paper, we discussed the problems which we observed concerning the claims which Muslims make towards their Qur'an. We noted the haphazard means by which the Qur'an was collected, and were appalled by the many abrogations and errors which exist in this supposedly perfect word of Allah. We came to the conclusion that the book could be nothing more than a man-made piece of literature which could not stand alongside the great literary compositions that we have in our possession today. Yet we found it troubling that there were so many inadequacies with this most holy book for the Muslims. So, as we approached the study of the collation of the Qur'an, we were shocked by the glaring deficiencies which were evidenced in its collection, forcing us to conclude that much of its content must have been added to much later. If this be so, we are now left with the question as to where the author or authors went for their material. Where were the sources for many of the stories and ideas which we find in the Qur'an? We've already addressed a couple: Zoroastrianism and ancient Jewish writings, not ancient Jewish scripture of the Old Testament. When we find the Qur'an, we are struck by the large number of biblical stories within its pages, yet these stories have little parallel with that which we read in our Bible. The subject is the same, but the actual account quite unbiblical. The Quranic accounts include many distortions, amendments, and some bizarre additions to that which we have heard our parents read to us at devotional times. So where did these stories come from, if not from the previous scriptures? Upon reading and observing these dubious teachings in the Qur'an, we are forced to ask whether they contain stories which have parallels in pre-Islamic writings which were of questionable authenticity. If so, then we should be able to find these apocryphal, meaning outside of biblical, extra-biblical accounts, and compare them with that which we read in the Qur'an. Fortunately, we do have much Jewish apocryphal literature, much of it from the Talmud, dating from the 2nd century CE, with which we can compare many of these stories. It is when we do so, that we find remarkable similarities between these fables or folk tales and the stories which are recounted in the Qur'an. The Talmudic writings were compiled in the 2nd century CE from oral laws, Mishnah, and traditions of those laws, Gemara. These laws and traditions have been created to adapt the law of Moses, the Torah, to the changing times. Those adaptations weren't biblical, weren't godly. Nevertheless, they're there. They also included interpretations and discussions of the laws, the halakha and the Haggadah, etc. Many Jews do not consider the Talmudic writings authoritative. I don't. But merely use them as windows with which to understand the times in which they were written. Historical value, to some extent, not scriptural. So how did these non-authoritative Talmudic writings come to be part of the Qur'an? In the Arabian Peninsula, known as the Hijaz, during the 7th century, many Jewish communities could be found. They were part of the diaspora who had fled Palestine after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE. A large number of these Jews were guided by these Talmudic writings, which have been passed down orally from father to son for generations. Each generation embellished the accounts, or at least, at times, incorporated local folklore, so that it was difficult to know what the original stories contained. There were even those amongst the Jews who believed that these Talmudic writings had been added to the preserved tablets, in other words, the Ten Commandments, and the Torah, which were kept in the Ark of the Covenant, and were believed to be replicas of the heavenly book. Well, we have Jews that weren't faithful to the Jewish religion as well. When Muhammad came onto the scene in the 7th century, some scholars believe he merely added to this body of literature the Qur'an. It is therefore not surprising that a number of these traditions from Judaism were inadvertently accepted by Muhammad, or perhaps later redactors, and incorporated into the religion of Islam. Those who are critical of these sources, yet who adhere to Muslim tradition, and consider Muhammad as the originator of the Qur'an, contend that many of these stories came to Muhammad via the Jewish friends which he had in Medina. So what? We do know from Muslim tradition that Muhammad's uncle, Waraka, translated portions of the Gospels into Arabic, and that Buhariya, a Nestorian monk, was the secret teacher. Now, Muslim tradition also maintains that Muhammad's 7th wife, Rayhana, and his 9th wife, Safiyya, were Jewesses. Furthermore, his first wife, Khadija, had a Christian background. His 8th wife, Maryam, also belonged to a Christian sect. It is likely that these wives shared with him much of their Old and New Testament literature, their dramas, and their prophetic stories. Whether these wives understood the distinction between authentic biblical literature and that which was apocryphal is not known. There would not have been literary scholars who would have simply related the stories they had heard from their local communities, much of which was Talmudic in origin, as we shall soon see. Another scenario is that many of the corresponding stories which we find in the Qur'an are from a later date, towards the end of the 8th century, or 100 to 150 years after the death of Muhammad, and have little to do with Muhammad. They were possibly written by later Persian or Syrian redactors who simply borrowed stories from their own oral traditions, Persian Zoroastrians or Byzantine Christians, as well as stories from the apocryphal Jewish literature which would have been around at that time. They then simply telescoped back into the stories onto the figure of Muhammad in the 7th century. What do you call phony? Whatever is the case, the Quranic accounts do have an interesting parallels with the Jewish apocryphal literature from the 2nd century CE. Let's look at a few of these accounts and compare them with the parallels which we find in other coexisting or predating literature of that period. Stories which correspond with biblical accounts. J1I, Satan's refusal to worship Adam. We've already touched on this. Surah 234, 1761, we find Satan, Iblis, who could be a fallen angel or a jinn, according to Surah 1850, refusing to bow down to Saint Adam. This story can be traced back to the 2nd century Talmud. Cain and Abel, the Qur'an version. A better story in this is the story of Cain and Abel in Surah 5, 27 to 32. The story begins much as it does in our own biblical account, with Cain killing his brother, Abel, though they are not named in the Quranic account. Yet in Ayah 31, after Cain slays Abel, the story changes and no longer follows the biblical account. Surah 5:30 to 32, written about out below and on the left. Where could this Quranic account have come from? Is this an historical record which is unknown to the biblical writers? Indeed, it was, as the source for this account was drafted after the New Testament was written. In fact, there are three sources from which this account is taken: the Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah, the Targum of Jerusalem, and a book called the Perk Rabbi Eliezer. All these three documents are Jewish writings from the Talmud, which were oral traditions from between 150 to 200 CE. These stories comment on the laws of the Bible, yet are known to contain nothing more than Hebrew myths and fables. As we read this particular story from these three sources, we find a striking parallel to the Quranic account. In Surah 531, then Allah sent a raven who scratched the ground to show him how to hide the shame of his brother. Woe is me, said he. Scratched? I think that should be scratched the ground. This guy didn't watch his spelling. Oops, fix it a little bit. Scratched the ground to show him how to hide the shame of his brother. Woe is me, said he. Was I not even able to be as this raven and to hide the shame of my brother? Then he became full of regrets. Targum of Jonathan ben Uzziah. Adam and Eve, sitting by the corpse, wept not knowing what to do, for they had as yet no knowledge of burial. A raven came up, took the dead body of its fellow, and having scratched at the earth, buried it thus before their eyes. Adam said, let us follow the example of the raven, so taking up Abel's body, buried it at once. Apart from the contrast between who buried who, the two stories are otherwise uncannily similar. We can only conclude that it was from here that Muhammad, or a later author, obtained their story. Thus we find that a Jewish fable, a myth, is repeated as historical fact in the Qur'an. Yet that is not all. For when we continue in our reading of the Surah 5, in the following ayah 32, we find a further proof of plagiarism from apocryphal Jewish literature, this time the Jewish Mishnah Sanhedrin 4, verse 5. Qur'an 5:32. On that account we ordain for the children of Israel that if anyone slew a person, unless it be for murder or for spreading mischief in the land, it would be as if he slew the whole people, and if anyone saved a life, it would be as if he saved the life of the whole people. In the Mishnah Sanhedrin 4:5, we find it said in the case of Cain, who murdered his brother, the voice of thy brother's blood crieth out. This latter is a quote from the Bible, Genesis 4:10. And he says, it does not saith he hath blood in the singular, but bloods in the plural. Thou was created single, in order to show that to him who kills a single individual, it should be reckoned that he has slain the whole race. But to him who has preserved the life of a single individual, it is counted that he has preserved the whole race. There is no connection between the previous verse, ayah 31, and that which we have just read, Surah 5:32 above. What does the death of Abel by Cain have to do with the slaying or saving of the whole people? Nothing. Ironically, this ayah 32, in fact, supports the basis of the Old Testament hope for the finished work of Jesus, who was to take away the sins of the world. See John 1:29. Yet it doesn't flow from the verse which preceded it. So why is it here? If we were to turn to the Jewish Talmud again, this time to the Mishnah Sanhedrin, chapter 4, verse 5 above and on the right, we will find where the author obtained his material and why he included it here. In this account we read a rabbi's comment where he interprets the word blood to mean his own blood and the blood of his seed. Remember, this is nothing but the comment of a rabbi. It is his own interpretation, one which is highly speculative at that. Therefore, it is rather interesting that he then goes to comment on the plural word for blood, yet this rabbi's comments are repeated almost word for word in the Qur'an in ayah 32 of Surah 5. How is it that a rabbi's comment on the biblical text, the muses of a mere human being, become the Quranic holy writ and attributed it to God? Did Allah learn something from the rabbi, or was it Muhammad or a later author